Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
My name is Katherine Nazzaro, and I'm the manager of Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I am here today talking to JB Hwang, who received her MFA in fiction from the University of Florida. And her short fiction and translation can be found in the Thames Review, the Denver Quarterly, Oxford Magazine, and December Magazine. She lived in San Francisco for 8 years and worked as a mail carrier during the pandemic. She currently lives in Philadelphia. And today we will be talking about her debut novel, Mendell Station. Her book, Mendell Station, comes out July 22nd, 2025. It's a truly stunning debut about a woman dealing with the loss of her friend and a crisis of faith who becomes a mail carrier right before the start of the pandemic. As a member of the Indies Introduced panel, I fell in love with this book from the first page, immediately before anything else was underlining sentences. And I think this is going to be a book that really sticks with you after you read it. Welcome, JB.
Thank you so much for having me and for all those kind words. It's truly an honor and so exciting to be a part of Indies Introduce. And I'm just really thankful to everyone that gave my book time and thought and felt a connection with it.
Fantastic. Well, we're so excited to have you. We're so excited to have you as a part of the list. And I guess let's start off with the questions. So my first
Mhm.
question is sort of by definition of what it's about. Mendell Station is a very insulated novel while containing so many excellent characters and depictions of community. And that is one of the things that I love the most about the book. Which of these was your favorite to write?
Yeah, so I don't know if there was a specific character that was my favorite to write, but my favorite, like the funnest thing to write was the humor of the Postal Service. It's so specific and hilarious, and just remembering it brought back good feelings. But it's very self-deprecating, very fatalistic, but also kind of cheesy in an aunt and uncle kind of way. And I just wanted to make sure I could convey how much humor was a part of surviving the work of the Postal Service.
I love that. And I think that really came through in the book. Um, which leads me into my next question. You yourself worked as a mail carrier. I have a lot of respect for the post office. Um, I I truly best uniforms out there.
Yes, thank you. Yes,
And
my book waxes poetic about the uniforms quite a bit.
it really is. I'm always one of the reasons I was really excited about your book is because I was like, I love the post office. I love a book about the post office. I feel like they don't get enough love. Um,
Mhm.
but you yourself worked at a post office. Was there any additional research you did for this book before writing?
Yeah, so a lot of the additional research was a bit more informal in the sense that my coworkers were always telling me stories about their years working in the service. So they talk about what was happening, what they went through at other stations, or just some of their craziest moments or their favorite moments. So research in the sense of I was just gathering their stories and kind of putting them in the novel. Another thing I did do, the union at orientation did share with us about the famous mail strike of 1970, which is
Mhm.
like a crowning achievement, really cool thing that happened. But I did want to add a few more historical details, so I did more research on it for the novel, just to add those. So yeah, that was the extent of my research on the Postal Service.
Very cool. Was there anything that you changed? Like this book does have a lot about the ins and outs of the Postal Service. Was there anything you changed because it made a better story?
Mhm. So one thing is my station was so nice and everyone was so kind. There was no interpersonal drama. And that doesn't make for a good novel when everyone is just super nice. I do think I conveyed some of their kindness, but I needed also some drama. So that I changed. And again, this was based on some of their stories. I tweaked and combined elements here and there, but that was probably the most fictionalized element was the drama. And yeah, so Miriam, I didn't go through everything Miriam went through, but that was kind of what I was drawing from.
Hmm. That's, I mean, excellent for you. Excellent to have in a workplace. Not as great for a story. That makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm.
So
Exactly.
my third question is, I was also an essential worker during the lockdown period of the pandemic. And one of the reasons that I really loved your book is that I found your depiction of that to be very deeply relatable. What was your experience of being an essential worker and how did that influence your writing?
So I think the major narrative out there about lockdown is being like locked up at home, super isolated and lonely, only seeing people in your bubble. But for me as an essential worker and for Miriam, the lockdown was the most social that she had ever been and the most that she ever traveled around the city and saw more parts of it. So yeah, I wanted to make sure that narrative was conveyed of the essential worker in the lockdown, which is kind of the opposite of many people's experience. And I also think a lot of being an essential worker, which is connected to the themes of the book, is when so much of your life and things you take for granted are suddenly taken away or destroyed or gone. Like, what remains essential in terms of what do you need to do to keep going? And because life goes on, even when these huge parts of your life suddenly disappear, whether it's Miriam's best friend or her faith. So yeah, I think the postal service and the essential work there also exemplified that. And I wanted to make those connections.
That makes sense. I think with Miriam specifically, obviously she like comes into this job right before the pandemic or like right at the start of the pandemic.
Hmm.
Um, which does change her every day, but I feel like that major change in her life also really captured working as an essential worker, like even if you were doing that job almost exactly the same before the pandemic, everything was so up in the air in
Hmm.
general that it felt like a major life shift, even if your job was the same and you were still going in.
That's so true. Yeah. The fact that the Postal Service, the work itself was the same before and after the lockdown, but because the context is suddenly so wildly different, everything about it also starts to feel different. And I think the same could be said about a lot of aspects of Miriam's life as well, whether it's her friendships or her like relationships outside her job. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I think you captured that so well.
Thank
Um,
you.
so we've talked about your research, we've talked about the post office. What was the rest of the writing process like for this book?
Yeah, so when I set out to write the book, I knew that there would be three main threads of the story. The first one would be the loss of the friend and the grief and the friendship. The second thread would be the spiritual crisis and all of the kind of theological questions that she has. And the third would be being an essential worker during the pandemic through the Postal Service. So the first thing I did was I kind of wrote out a list of all my most memorable moments and stories from the Postal Service and how things that I thought needed to be included in the book. And then I would map out the arc of the friendship between Miriam and Esther, like essential moments defining experiences that they had, and also the experience of Miriam's grief. And then I wrote out some kind of religious questions that I knew or ideas that I knew Miriam would want to talk about, whether it was the nature of work or hell was another big one. Um, and then I needed to weave these three strands together to make sure they weren't these isolated threads that don't converse with each other, but rather have them affect each other, affect what happens next, affect how she sees things. And that was kind of how the book was crafted.
I love that. That's it. I feel like you did an incredible job of like weaving those together and forming the story.
Thank you.
They were definitely different themes, but reading the novel, it didn't feel like three different threads. It felt like it was all so consistent.
Oh, great. I'm really happy to hear that.
And so we've talked about this crisis of faith a little bit
Mhm.
already. I will say that's one of the things that like I think I was the first person on the panel to finish your book. And that was one of the things that my fellow panelists were immediately asking. So how does that end? How does that resolve?
Mhm.
Um, and I think is one of the like very compelling things about your novel. Uh, so you depict this major crisis of faith in a way that I have not seen depicted in fiction previously.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that depiction a little bit and what inspired it?
Yeah. Well, I think the things I wanted to avoid were either just talking about the oppressive and hypocritical aspects of religion or the most beautiful parts of religion and like why it's worth kind of why so many people center their lives around it. I think the best fiction that deals with like religion always shows both what's repulsive and attractive about it and kind of the wrestling that happens. So some books that come to mind are James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Marilyn Robinson's Gilead or Home, or that series. Oh, and Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov also deals a lot with religious issues. But yeah, it was really important for me to show why Miriam could never go back to her faith and the ways in which it kind of burned her, but also how much she missed parts of it or how much it will always be a part of who she is and like kind of be a part of her identity, even the whole of the religion, like the absence of it. So yeah, that I'm really glad you picked up on that aspect of it.
Yeah, definitely. And like like I said about every part of this book, I think it was really
Mhm.
well done.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
I am not somebody who has personally had a lot of religion in my life, and
Mhm.
still that part of it felt like really resonated, I feel. Um, and I think
Thank
that was
you.
my last question. Do you have anything else you would like to say about Mendell Station before it comes out?
Um, Again, I'm just really pleased and thankful for this honor and all the things you mentioned about it. I do feel like were the major parts of the book that I wanted to make sure came across. And it's just extremely gratifying as a writer who's been working on a project kind of for so long to have these things understood and feel seen, and also to see the reader like you interpret and interact with it in new ways that I hadn't thought of. So I'm just extremely thankful. Thank you so much for enjoying the book as you did.
Of course. And thank you so much for coming here and being a part of this podcast and being a part of Indies Introduced.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA site at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!